Welcome to Dead Air Confessions. Late at night, when the streets are empty and the signal begins to fade, people start sharing the things they never say out loud. The strange call they received, the person they saw standing outside, the night they realized they were not alone. Tonight, you will hear stories from people who carried those memories for years. Before we go on air, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a quiet, late-night feel, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions. Turn the volume down low. The line is open.
One night I was sitting alone in my room when I heard a sound outside that immediately made me stop what I was doing. I live in a small housing area surrounded by woods, so hearing animals at night was not unusual. There were always noises, birds, branches, animals moving through leaves. Wind. Sometimes things would make sounds that were surprisingly loud because there was not much traffic or city noise to cover them. But this was different. It sounded like something between the call of a crow and a child crying. That is the closest comparison I can make. It was harsh and strange, but there was also something almost human about it. The first time I heard it, I froze. Then it happened again. I remember feeling that immediate cold nervousness you get when you hear something outside at night but cannot identify it. My bedroom had a roof window, basically a skylight that I could open and look out through. Normally, I did not think twice about it. That night, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to stay inside and ignore whatever was making the noise. But curiosity won. I wanted to know what animal could possibly sound like that. So I went to the roof window and looked outside. At first, I could not see anything. It was dark, and the houses around mine were only partly visible. Beyond them were the woods. At night, everything out there turned into layers of black. Roofs, trees, branches, the edges of buildings. It was difficult to judge distance properly. I kept looking. Then after a few seconds, I noticed something moving. There was a figure on one of the roofs farther away. I know how ridiculous this description is going to sound, but the first thing it reminded me of was an Enderman from Minecraft. Not because it looked exactly like a video game character, it was because of the proportions. It seemed incredibly tall, very thin, entirely black, and its arms looked much too long. From where I was standing, they seemed to hang almost all the way down toward its feet. I could not see a face. I could not make out clothing. I could not see any lighter skin. It was just a dark human-like shape against the night. At first, I thought maybe I was looking at a weird tree or chimney. Then, it moved. It appeared to jump from one part of a roof to another, then toward another house. That was when I stopped trying to convince myself it was a stationary object. Something was moving across the rooftops, and from the way it moved, I had the strong impression that it was searching for something. It would stop, look around, move again. At least, that was how it appeared to me from the window. I was far enough away that I could not see exactly what it was doing. But when you are frightened, even the direction a silhouette is facing starts to feel meaningful. I remember thinking, it is looking for something. Then, the screaming sound came again, that strange mixture of bird and crying child. I shut the roof window immediately. I did not stay there trying to get a better look. I did not grab a camera. I did not think I should record this. I was too scared. I closed the window, backed away from it, and started crying. I called one of my friends because I did not want to sit alone with what I had just seen. While I was talking to my friend, I could still hear the noises outside. Every time that scream came through the roof or window, I felt worse. It continued for a few minutes. Then eventually, everything became quiet. not gradually. At least that is not how I remember it. The sounds simply stopped. The housing estate returned to normal nighttime silence. I stayed away from the roof window. I do not remember sleeping very well. The next morning, nothing outside looked unusual. The same houses, same roofs, same trees. It almost made the previous night feel unreal. That is one of the strange things about frightening nighttime experiences. Something can seem completely impossible in darkness. Then daylight arrives, and the exact same place looks harmless. For a while, I tried to tell myself that I had seen an animal. We lived around woods. Animals make bizarre sounds. That explanation made sense, but I could not get the shape out of my head. Whatever I had seen looked too tall, too upright, too human, and the arms seemed impossibly long. Then, a few days later, something happened nearby that made the whole memory much darker. A man's body was found near our housing estate. I heard that the body had been badly torn. I do not know every detail of what happened to him, and I do not want to pretend I know more than I do. I never saw the body myself. I only knew that someone had been found dead nearby. Because it happened only a few days after I had seen the figure on the roofs, my mind immediately connected the two events. I started thinking about the way the figure had seemed to search around. The screaming, the long arms, the fact that we were surrounded by forest. What if whatever I had seen had something to do with that man's death? That thought frightened me much more than the original sighting. But looking back, that connection is not something I can prove. Two disturbing things happened in the same general area within a few days. That does not automatically mean one caused the other. The man could have died for completely unrelated reasons. An accident, an animal attack, another person, something medical followed by exposure to wildlife. Without knowing the actual investigation, I cannot say. The timing made the connection feel obvious. That does not make it real. Still, after that, I became nervous about the roof window. Even during normal nights, opening it felt different. Before, it was just part of my room. Afterward, every time I looked at it, I remembered that black shape standing on the neighboring roofs. I also became more uncomfortable returning home late at night. Walking through a housing area surrounded by forest already feels different after midnight. Once your brain has attached one frightening image to the place, every shadow starts suggesting it. Tall tree, person, post, something on a roof. You look twice. Usually there is nothing. For a while, I kept the story mostly to myself. Part of me worried people would think I had imagined it. I understood how it sounded. A giant black humanoid with long arms jumping over roofs and making screaming noises sounds exactly like something a frightened person would invent after watching horror videos or playing games. The Enderman comparison certainly did not help. But that was genuinely the closest visual reference I had. Much later, I finally decided to ask the people who lived in one of the houses where I remembered seeing the figure. I did not know what I expected. Maybe they would laugh. Maybe they would say they had seen absolutely nothing. Instead, they told me they had heard loud noises that night. They also remembered something stomping or moving around on their roof. That gave me chills all over again. They had not seen the figure, as far as I know, but they had heard something. And because we lived near the woods, they had not considered it important. To them, strange animals around the property were normal. That was both reassuring and unsettling. Reassuring because it suggested there had probably been a real animal or physical source making noise. Unsettling because it meant I had not simply imagined everything. Something had apparently been on or around that roof. The question is what? There are several possibilities that make more sense than a giant humanoid creature. The sound itself is probably the easiest part to explain. Animals can make unbelievably human noises. Foxes are a good example. A fox scream can sound like a person being attacked. If you hear one without knowing what it is, it can be terrifying. Some birds can also produce calls that sound almost human. Owls make a wider range of noises than the classic hoot people expect. Certain calls can sound like screams, whistles, cries, or even strange voices. Ravens and crows can make harsh sounds too. In a forested area, there could have been multiple animals calling at once. Maybe the crow-like part came from a bird, and the crying sound came from something else. At night, sound travels strangely. A noise coming from a tree behind a house can seem like it is coming from the roof. That could explain the screaming without anything paranormal. The rooftop movement is harder, but still not impossible. A large animal on a roof could sound much heavier than it actually is. Cats, martins, raccoon-like animals, depending on the region. Birds, something moving over tiles can create loud, stomping sounds inside the house. The people underneath may imagine something much bigger than the actual animal. I do not know what wildlife was common enough in that specific area to identify one confidently, but living beside woods increases the possibilities. The human-looking silhouette may have been separate from the animal producing the sound. That is important. I assumed the scream came from the black figure because I heard the noise and then saw the figure. But I never actually saw its mouth open. I never saw it make the sound. Maybe there were two unrelated things outside. An animal calling from the woods, and a human being, tree shadow, or another animal on the roofs. My brain connected them because they happened together. That would make the whole event much easier to explain. The apparent height and long arms could easily have been affected by perspective. Looking through a roof window at night is not a good way to measure proportions. I was looking at dark roofs against dark woods. The figure itself was almost completely black. When there is little visual detail, the brain determines the edges of an object from contrast. Branches behind a person can become part of the body. A coat can extend the shape. A shadow can stretch limbs. A person carrying something long could look like they had bizarre arms. Even two overlapping objects can become one creature. Imagine a normal person standing near a chimney with a branch crossing behind them. From far away, in darkness, the branch could look like an arm hanging to the ground. If the person moves, your brain may continue interpreting the whole silhouette as one body. The jumping could also have been something less dramatic than I remember. Roofs are at different heights. A person moving along a roofline may briefly disappear behind one section, then appear on another. From a distance, that can look like a jump. An animal moving along tree branches close to the roofs could create an even stranger effect. If the branches and roof edges overlap visually, it might appear to leap directly from house to house. Distance is extremely difficult to judge at night because there are fewer reference points. Something in a tree 20 feet behind a roof can look like it is standing directly on the roof. That possibility may explain a lot. Maybe what I thought was a tall creature running over houses was actually an animal moving through branches behind them. If the animal was something with a long body or tail, the silhouette could look bizarre. The neighbors hearing roof noises still fits because a second animal could have been on their house. Or branches could have been hitting the roof. Wind can make a branch repeatedly strike tiles hard enough to sound like footsteps. Again, several ordinary things may have combined. There is also the possibility that it really was a person. Someone climbing roofs at night would be dangerous and strange, but people do strange things. A teenager, someone intoxicated, a burglar. someone trying to avoid being seen. A person wearing black clothing against the night could look almost featureless. If they were thin and carrying long objects, the silhouette might appear inhuman. The sounds from the roof would obviously fit. If the person was doing something illegal or reckless, the way they moved around could look like searching. That possibility is disturbing for a completely different reason. I do not know whether there were any reports of someone climbing buildings in the area, but a human explanation should not be ignored just because the figure looked unusual. Nighttime silhouettes distort people dramatically. There is also the chance that the figure itself was partly a fear response. I definitely saw something moving. I am not saying I invented the entire event, but after hearing the scream, I was already frightened before I looked outside. My brain was searching for the cause. When I found an ambiguous dark shape, I interpreted it through fear. Tall, long arms. Searching, jumping, those descriptions may have become stronger later. Memory does not preserve an exact recording. Every time I remembered the creature, the strangest features would naturally stand out. The arms almost reaching its feet. The impossible height. The blackness. Those details make the figure memorable. Small, ordinary details fade. Maybe it had been much closer to normal human proportions than I now picture. The Enderman comparison could even influence the memory afterward. Once I thought, it looked like an Enderman. That visual template may have shaped future recollections. Now when I remember it, I remember the comparison too. That does not mean the original sighting was imaginary. It means later memory can become more organized around the label we give something. The death discovered nearby is the part I have to be most careful with. It is extremely easy to connect frightening events after the fact. I see something strange. Days later, somebody dies. Now the strange thing becomes an omen or killer. But if the man died without any evidence involving rooftops, unusual footprints, animal attacks matching what I saw, or witnesses connecting the two, then there is no factual reason to assume a connection. The timing is creepy. That is all I can say. In a small area, a serious death will naturally become attached to whatever unusual thing people remember from around that time. If the death had happened a month earlier, I might never connect them. If it happened 2 years later, same, because it was only days later, the events became one story in my mind. That is understandable. But it is not evidence. If the body had been damaged, wildlife might even have reached it after death. That can create disturbing injuries without telling you what originally happened. Again, I do not know the circumstances, so I would not speculate beyond that. The neighbor's account is more useful. They apparently heard loud noises and something that sounded like stomping on their roof. That suggests there was an external physical event. But they did not report a giant black humanoid. So their testimony supports the noise, not necessarily my identification of the figure. That distinction matters. Maybe we experienced the same animal from different perspectives. They heard it. I saw an unclear silhouette. Or maybe they heard something separate while I was watching a distant person or shadow. What their story does make less likely is that the entire night happened only in my imagination. There were real noises. That is enough. If I had to rank the possibilities now, I would put wildlife and distorted nighttime perception near the top. The crying crow sound strongly fits animal calls. The forest setting makes wildlife expected. The roof noises also fit animals or branches. The strange humanoid shape could have been an animal viewed from a bad angle, something in a tree behind the houses, or a person whose silhouette became distorted in darkness. The screaming and the figure may not even have had the same source. That combination could create exactly the kind of experience I had. Would that make the night less frightening? Not really. At the time, I did not have any of those explanations. I had a strange scream, a black figure, long arms, movement across roofs, then silence. I was alone enough to panic and call a friend. That fear was real, no matter what caused it. The experience also changed my behavior. Even now, opening that roof window can bring the memory back. The logical part of my mind can say fox, bird, shadow, person, branches. The emotional part remembers looking through the glass and seeing something that did not seem to fit any animal I knew. That is how these experiences stay with you. You can produce reasonable explanations years later, but you cannot replace what the moment felt like. I also understand why the neighbors did not care much. People who live near forests get accustomed to noises that would terrify someone from a city. Something runs across a roof, probably an animal. Something screams in the woods, probably an animal. A branch hits the house. Ignore it. If they had been frightened by every sound, they would never sleep. Their casual response is actually evidence in favor of something ordinary. They knew the environment better. The same noises that sounded impossible to me may have been familiar enough to them. Of course, I still wonder what they would say if they had looked outside at exactly the moment I did. Would they have seen a normal animal? A person? Nothing? Or the same tall black shape? That is the information I do not have. I wish I had stayed at the window for a few more seconds. Not because it would have been smart. If there really had been a person climbing roofs, staying visible at a window might not have been safe. But from the perspective of solving the mystery, a longer look could have changed everything. Maybe the figure would turn and reveal normal clothing. Maybe it would climb into a tree. Maybe a large bird would take off. Maybe I would realize there were branches behind it. Instead, fear ended the observation. I shut the window. That preserved the strangest possible version. The same happened with the sound. I did not record it. If I had, someone familiar with local wildlife might identify it instantly. There are recordings online of animal calls that people mistake for screaming humans all the time. I may have been one recording away from solving half the story. But I was frightened. At that age, my priority was not evidence. It was getting away from the window. So the mystery survived. I do not believe I saw an Enderman. I do not think a Minecraft creature appeared in the real world. That was only a comparison my brain used because the proportions seemed so strange. I also cannot say I saw a supernatural creature. There simply is not enough evidence. What I saw was a dark, moving silhouette at night from some distance away. That is the most accurate description. Everything else depends on interpretation. I can say the silhouette appeared extremely tall. Its arms seemed very long. It appeared to move over or around the rooftops. And real noises were heard that night, including by neighbors. Those are the strongest facts I have. The rest is uncertainty. Maybe it was a person. Maybe wildlife. Maybe branches and perspective. Maybe more than one thing combined. The later death makes the memory darker, but without evidence connecting the events, I treat it as a disturbing coincidence. That is probably where the story should stay. I still do not like opening that roof window late at night. I still feel uncomfortable coming home alone when the housing estate is completely dark and the woods become one solid wall of black. Sometimes an animal cries somewhere between the trees and my body reacts before my brain can identify it. And whenever I look toward those roofs, I remember that night. The sound came first. Something between a crow and a crying child. Then I looked outside, expecting an animal. Instead, for a few seconds, I saw a black shape towering over the roofline. with arms that seemed far too long for a person, moving from house to house like it was searching for something. Maybe darkness changed its proportions. Maybe fear did. Maybe I never saw it as clearly as I think I did. There are enough ordinary explanations that I do not need to call it a creature. But there is one thing the neighbors confirmed for me years later. Whatever I was looking at that night, I was not the only person who knew something was moving across those roofs. When I was little, probably somewhere between 4 and 8 years old, I had a habit of losing things, mostly toys. I was an active kid, always running around, carrying things from room to room, taking toys outside, leaving them under furniture, forgetting where I had put them. So losing something was not unusual. But around the same time, I had also become confused about religion. Something had happened at our church. Some kind of scandal that the adults understood much better than I did. I was too young to really understand what had happened, but I understood enough to know that something was wrong. It made the whole idea of God feel strange to me. Adults would tell me to pray. They would talk about God listening. But in my little kid brain, I could not understand what that actually meant. I had never seen God. I could not hear anyone answering. So I developed my own very simple explanation. Praying meant talking to the air. God was somehow in the air. You talked to the air, God heard you, and then maybe God helped. That was basically the entire theology of my childhood mind. One day I lost my favorite Batman toy. At that age, this was a serious problem. It was not just another toy I could replace with something else. I really loved that Batman figure, and I had no idea where it had gone. I searched around. Nothing. Eventually, I remembered prayer. So I thought I would try it. I sat down and basically asked God to give me my Batman toy back. Then I waited. Nothing happened. No toy appeared. No sign. No sudden idea telling me where to look. I remember becoming genuinely upset. Children have a very direct sense of fairness. I had asked. God was supposed to be able to do anything, so why wasn't my Batman toy back? I became angry with God. I probably felt cheated. I had done the thing adults told me to do, and it had not worked. Eventually, I got up. Around that time, I accidentally hurt myself while getting into bed. It was nothing dramatic, just one of those little childhood accidents. But afterward, I remember feeling something strange in the room. The atmosphere seemed different. I cannot describe it much better than that. It felt like the air had changed. I had the sense that something was there, or that something had shifted, although I could not see anything. Then, around 3 days later, I found the Batman toy. Obviously, losing a toy and finding it 3 days later is completely normal. It had probably been somewhere in the house the entire time. But I was a little kid trying to understand cause and effect. And my brain built a pattern. I prayed. I got hurt. Then I found the toy. Those 3 things became connected. The next time I lost something, I prayed again. At first, nothing happened. That bothered me, because I had already decided that the Batman incident meant the prayer had worked. So I started thinking about what had been different the first time. Then I remembered getting hurt. That became the missing piece in my mind. I started to believe that asking alone was not enough. I thought I had to hurt myself too. I was still very young, and I did not understand how dangerous that kind of association could become. To me, it was just an experiment. Do this. Then, maybe, the lost thing comes back. So when I misplaced toys, I would repeat the strange little ritual I had invented. I would pray and then deliberately hurt myself. I do not remember anybody teaching me this. No church told me to do it. My parents did not tell me. It was something my childhood brain created by connecting two unrelated events. And the worst part was that eventually it seemed to work. Not immediately. But sooner or later, I would find whatever toy I had lost. Of course I did. Most lost toys are not gone forever. They are under the bed, behind the couch, in another room, outside in a bag. Someone moved them. A child forgets where they left something, searches again later, and eventually finds it. But at that age, I did not think in probabilities. I thought in patterns. I prayed. I paid some kind of price. The toy came back. So the ritual became reinforced. Every successful recovery made the connection stronger. If I prayed and did the ritual and found the toy the next day, that was proof. If it took a week, it still counted. If I eventually remembered where I had left it, that counted too. The failures probably did not stay in my memory as strongly. That is how a strange belief can grow without anyone deliberately creating it. I simply accepted it. For years, it was part of the way I understood the world. Then, something else started happening. I began having a recurring dream. It was always connected, at least in my memory, to those periods when I had prayed. The dream involved me walking along a road in a city. There was a canal beside or near the road. The place felt familiar inside the dream, even though I could not say where it was in real life. I would walk along this road, and there would be a man with me. Except, man is not quite right. He looked like a skeleton and a normal person at the same time. I could see the shape of a skeleton, but he also seemed to have skin. Not transparent skin exactly. More like both versions existed at once. A normal human body and bones underneath it, both somehow visible in the dream. He walked beside me. I do not remember him attacking me. I do not remember some dramatic conversation. He was simply there. That may have been what made him more unsettling. He was not a monster chasing me. He was a companion. The dream treated him as somebody who belonged beside me. I started thinking of him as this strange, skeletal man, and outside the dream, I sometimes had the feeling that he was around the house, too. Not that I clearly saw him standing in rooms. It was more of a presence, a sense that the character from the dream had followed me into waking life. As a child, I did not have a complicated explanation for that. Kids can move between imagination, dreams, and reality much more easily than adults. An imaginary friend can be emotionally real without a child pretending. A nightmare creature can still feel present the next afternoon. If you dream repeatedly about the same person, that person starts to feel familiar. So this skeleton man became part of my childhood world. Then I got older. Toys became less important. I stopped carrying Batman figures around and moved on to video games. Eventually, I got into Halo on Xbox. An Xbox game is much harder to lose than a small toy. So I no longer had the same reason to perform my strange prayer ritual. The whole thing gradually stopped. No deliberate decision. I did not wake up one morning and say, I no longer believe in this. I simply grew out of the circumstances that had created it. I stopped losing toys. I stopped asking for them back. The ritual disappeared. And eventually, so did the skeleton man. Or at least I stopped thinking about him. Years passed. The entire thing became one of those blurry childhood memories that hardly seems connected to the person you are now. Then a couple of months ago, I was talking to a friend about ghosts and weird experiences. Somehow, I told him this story. I explained the praying, the lost toys, the strange belief that hurting myself had somehow made the prayer work. The recurring skeleton man. My friend listened and then gave me one of the funniest and creepiest interpretations possible. He said it sounded like I had developed a transactional relationship with a demon. I laughed. Because when you put the story that way, it does sound like one. Child asks for something. Child offers pain. Lost object returns. Mysterious skeletal figure begins appearing. That is basically the setup for a horror movie. But I did not actually believe that was what had happened. At least I did not think I did. Still, the conversation made me remember details I had not thought about in years. So I brought it up to my mom. I expected her either to remember nothing or to tell me I had always been an imaginative child. Instead, she said something that caught me completely off guard. She told me I used to have an imaginary friend. Apparently, I called him the Bone Man. I had no memory of that name. None. I remembered the skeleton figure from the dreams. But I did not remember walking around as a child talking about someone called the Bone Man. My mom did. She remembered me referring to him like an imaginary friend. That was strange enough. Then she mentioned something else. Sometimes she would find unexplained little cuts or scratches on me. She never thought much of them because I was an active kid. I played outside. I climbed things. I ran around. Children come home with scratches constantly. So as far as she was concerned, there was no mystery. But hearing that immediately after talking about the Bone Man made the childhood story feel much darker. My friend had joked about a demon. Then my mom independently remembered a skeletal imaginary friend I had apparently named. And she remembered unexplained marks. It was tempting to put everything together, but I think it is important to separate what actually happened from the story my adult brain can build around it now. The toy situation is probably the easiest part to explain. Children lose toys and find them later. I connected the recovery to whatever I happened to do beforehand. The first Batman incident created a false association. Prayer, accidental pain, toy recovered. My brain treated the sequence as cause and effect. Then I deliberately repeated it. That is basic learning. If an action appears to produce a reward, even randomly, you are more likely to repeat it. The more unpredictable the reward is, the stronger the habit can sometimes become. I had effectively created my own superstition. The fact that I eventually found toys reinforced it every time. If I had just waited without praying or hurting myself, I probably would have found most of the same toys. But there was no control experiment in my childhood bedroom. I never tested loose toy. Do absolutely nothing unusual. Wait, find toy. So I never learned that the ritual was unnecessary. That is why I do not think there was anything supernatural about the toys returning. The ritual did not summon them. It did not make the universe return them. I was simply finding misplaced objects. The disturbing part is that I had attached self-inflicted pain to the process. As an adult, I can see how dangerous that belief was. At the time, though, it probably felt like a rule. Kids invent rules all the time. Step only on certain tiles. Count before turning off the light. Do something 3 times or something bad will happen. Mine happened to involve a harmful action because of one accidental association. The Bone Man is more interesting, but even he has several ordinary explanations. Children commonly have imaginary companions. Some are people, some are animals, some are monsters. Some are very strange. A skeletal man is unusual, but not impossible for a kid's imagination. I grew up around church imagery. Ideas about death, cartoons, games, Halloween decorations, movies, books, and whatever else children absorb. I could have seen a skeleton somewhere and built a character around it. The fact that I do not remember calling him the Bone Man does not mean my mother's memory is wrong. Childhood memories disappear. Parents often remember phases their children completely forget. Maybe I talked about him for months. maybe only a few times. My mother remembered the name because it sounded creepy. I forgot because it was ordinary to me. The recurring dream could have come afterward. Maybe I already had an imaginary friend called the Bone Man, and my dreaming brain placed him beside me. Or the order could be reversed. I dreamed about the skeletal man first, then started talking about him while awake. Eventually, I called him the Bone Man. Years later, I remember the dreams, but not the waking imaginary friend phase. That would explain the overlap perfectly. The sense that he was sometimes in the house could also be normal childhood imagination. If you repeatedly dream about the same figure, thinking about him while awake can produce a strong feeling of presence, especially at night, especially when alone. A hallway feels occupied. A dark room feels like someone is inside. You do not necessarily see anything, but your body reacts. That is enough for the character to seem real. There is another possibility. The Bone Man may have been part of how I processed the religious confusion happening around me. I had been exposed to some kind of church scandal. I did not understand it. At the same time, I was trying to figure out God, prayer, punishment, reward, and whether invisible beings were listening. Those are huge concepts for a small child. My strange ritual turned prayer into a transaction. Ask for something, give something, receive something. The Bone Man may have become a character that represented that system, not consciously. Dreams do not usually work that neatly. But the pieces were all present. Invisible power, requests, pain, fear, reward, death imagery. A child could build something unsettling from that without realizing it. My friend's demon contract joke works because it takes those same pieces and gives them an adult supernatural interpretation. But that interpretation was not necessarily present when I was little. I was not thinking, I am sacrificing something to a demon. I was thinking like a child experimenting with a rule. That difference matters. The cuts my mother remembered also do not prove anything supernatural. I was active outside. Children scratched themselves on branches, fences, toys, rough furniture, fingernails, and things they cannot even remember encountering. And because I had developed that harmful ritual for a while. Some marks may even have had an ordinary behavioral explanation connected to that period. There is no reason to imagine the Bone Man physically cutting me. Nothing in my memory shows that happening. The timing also matters. My mother remembered the scratches because I brought up the old imaginary friend. Once two old details are discussed together, they begin to feel connected. But perhaps they were not. Maybe she saw scratches throughout my childhood. Maybe the Bone Man phase lasted only a few months. Maybe those things barely overlapped. Without records, neither of us can reconstruct the exact timeline. That is how childhood stories become more frightening when retold as adults. We collect separate fragments, then build one continuous narrative. I also do not know how much the dream itself has changed in memory. The city, the canal, the road, the skeleton man. Those are the parts that remain. Maybe he originally looked less frightening. Maybe he did not always appear after prayer. Maybe I had several similar dreams and later grouped them together. Memory likes patterns, especially when we revisit something after years. The more I tell the story as, every time I prayed, I dreamed about him, the stronger that association becomes. But unless I had kept a dream diary as a child, there is no way to know how consistent it really was. That does not mean the memory is false. It means exact frequency is difficult to trust. What I find most interesting is how ordinary the whole thing felt to me while it was happening. I apparently had an imaginary friend called the Bone Man. That should sound terrifying. But I do not remember being constantly terrified of him. The recurring dream was strange, but he walked beside me. He was not chasing me. The ritual was harmful, but I did not understand it as harmful. It was simply something I believed helped lost toys come back. Children can normalize almost anything if it becomes part of their routine. That may be why the story did not feel like a horror story until years later. Adult me looks backward and sees a child confused about God, a ritual involving pain, lost objects returning, a skeletal companion, unexplained marks. Those pieces sound ominous. Child me probably saw, I lost Batman. I asked for help. Eventually, I found Batman. There is my weird imaginary friend again. Completely different perspective. That is why I am hesitant to retroactively turn the Bone Man into something evil. I do not remember him threatening me. I do not remember hearing a voice demanding anything. I do not remember him telling me to hurt myself. That part came from my own mistaken association. The idea of a demon only appeared years later when my friend joked about it. So there is no reason to assign the ritual to the Bone Man. That connection is something we can create after the fact. If anything, the story is a good example of how superstition can form naturally. One coincidence happens at exactly the wrong age. A child interprets it. The interpretation changes behavior. Later coincidences reinforce the behavior. Then dreams and imagination grow around the belief. Years pass. The original logic is forgotten, but the images remain. Then, an adult hears the story and says, "That sounds like a demon." Suddenly, everything gets reclassified. Even the Batman toy starts sounding sinister. But it probably was not. It was probably under furniture or mixed into another box somewhere for 3 days. That is almost certainly the least mysterious part of the whole experience. The detail that still bothers me slightly is my mother's memory of the Bone Man. Not because it proves anything paranormal. It does not. It bothers me because I had completely forgotten that I had apparently given the figure a name. I remembered him visually. I remembered the dreams, but not the fact that he had been part of my waking childhood, too. That makes me wonder how much else I have forgotten. Maybe my mother remembers me describing exactly what he looked like. Maybe I told her about the canal. Maybe I talked to him in the house. Or maybe Bone Man was just a random imaginary friend unrelated to my later dream memory, and my adult brain fused them because the names fit. That is possible, too. Two skeleton characters in a child's imagination do not necessarily have to be the same one. Once again, memory wants one story. Reality may have been messier. I also wonder whether my church experiences influenced the name. Skeletons and death have obvious religious associations. Churches talk about souls, heaven, hell, death, resurrection, angels, demons, and invisible beings. Even if adults try to explain those things gently, a child's imagination can transform them into extremely vivid imagery. Maybe the Bone Man was my attempt to give a body to an idea I could not understand. Maybe God is the air, and Bone Man walks beside me were both solutions created by the same child trying to make invisible concepts visible. That explanation makes sense to me. It also makes the story sadder than supernatural. I was trying to understand things I was too young to understand. The harmful ritual grew out of that confusion. Luckily, I eventually stopped, not because I solved the theology, because I stopped losing toys. Halo may have accidentally broken the entire system. You cannot misplace Master Chief under the couch when he lives inside the Xbox. Without the repeated trigger, the ritual lost its purpose. The Bone Man stopped being relevant. Life moved on. That is another reason I doubt there was an external entity demanding something from me. If there had been a demon maintaining a transaction, you would expect it to continue. Escalate. Demand attention. The story did the opposite. I stopped participating. Nothing happened. No punishment. No mysterious pressure to return. No bone man appearing years later to collect a debt. The whole thing simply faded as I grew older. That is exactly what I would expect from a childhood superstition, not a supernatural contract. When I told my friend the story, his description made me laugh because it sounded so dramatic compared with what I remembered. A transactional relationship with a demon. It is a great line. But I do not think that is what happened. I think I accidentally trained myself to believe that pain and prayer were connected to finding things. I think I had a recurring dream involving a creepy but strangely familiar imaginary figure. And I think my mother's later memory of the Bone Man gave the story a second life. Still, there is something eerie about hearing someone else remember a part of your childhood that you completely forgot. Especially when the forgotten part is, oh yeah, you had an imaginary friend called the Bone Man. That is not exactly the sentence you want to hear after telling someone about a recurring skeletal figure in your dreams. The unexplained scratches added another layer. But again, scratches are normal for an active child. I would not connect them to anything paranormal without much stronger evidence. What worries me more in hindsight is that nobody knew about the ritual I had created. A little kid had quietly decided that asking for help required getting hurt. That is the part I wish I could go back and correct. Not because I think I was in danger from a demon, because children can build frightening rules from coincidences and keep following them if no one knows. If I could talk to that version of myself now, I would tell him the Batman toy came back, because lost toys usually turn up eventually. There was no payment, no deal, no need to prove anything. And whatever the Bone Man was, dream, imaginary friend, or forgotten character, he did not earn the right to be connected to that pain just because adult hindsight makes the story fit. I still like wondering what the recurring city was. Why the canal? Why the road? Why was the Bone Man walking with me instead of chasing me? Why did he have both skin and a skeleton at the same time? Dreams can create incredibly specific images without giving us an explanation. Maybe I saw a picture somewhere. Maybe a game or cartoon had a similar character. Maybe the place was built from several real locations. Maybe none of it had a source I could ever identify. That uncertainty is enough. I do not need to turn him into a demon. But I cannot deny that the story sounds much creepier now than it did when I was living it. A little kid loses his favorite Batman toy. He prays. A few days later, the toy returns. He decides prayer needs a price. Soon afterward, a skeletal man begins appearing in recurring dreams and becomes enough of a presence that his mother later remembers the child calling him the Bone Man. Then, years later, after the child has forgotten almost all of it, someone jokes that it sounds like he had made a deal with something. Probably not. Almost certainly not. The toys were just lost. The marks had ordinary causes. The Bone Man was probably imagination. But I still sometimes think about my mom casually telling me that name. Not asking whether I remembered it. Telling me. Because apparently when I was little, the red flags that now sound like the setup to a ghost story were ordinary enough to me that I eventually forgot them. And somewhere in the middle of all those forgotten childhood years, there was apparently a person made of bones who walked beside me often enough that I once considered him a friend. I was around 18 when this happened, and even now I think sleep paralysis is probably the best explanation. But at the time, lying there in the dark, it did not feel like a dream. It felt like somebody had actually walked into my bedroom. I had been asleep for a while when something woke me in the middle of the night. The first thing I remember was hearing my bedroom door open, not imagining that it might have moved. I remember the sound of it. Then I heard what sounded like someone stepping into the room. That immediately made me alert. I lived with my family, so hearing someone open my door was not automatically frightening. My first thought was that it was probably my mom or dad. Maybe they were checking on me. Maybe one of them needed something. Maybe they were trying to scare me for some reason. I opened my eyes. There was someone standing in front of the door. The room was almost completely dark, but I could see the figure, and that is the part that still bothers me. It did not look like the vague shape you sometimes mistake for a person at night. It did not look like a pile of clothes. It did not seem blurry. I could see the outline clearly enough that I was immediately certain I was looking at a person, a very tall person. They were standing just inside the room, directly in front of the door. I could not tell whether it was a man or a woman. There was not enough light for facial details. But the height was obvious. Whoever or whatever I was looking at seemed much taller than either of my parents. I stayed still and watched. At first I was confused more than terrified. If it was my mom or dad, why were they just standing there? Why had they not said anything? I waited for the figure to move. It did not. I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. I had just woken up. The room was dark. Maybe I was looking at a shadow. So I closed my eyes. Then I opened them again. The figure was still there, exactly where it had been. I closed my eyes again, opened them, still there. That was when the fear really started. Normally, when you mistake something in a dark room for a person, blinking or looking again helps. Your eyes adjust. You recognize the chair, the coat, the door, whatever it is. That did not happen. Every time I opened my eyes, the tall figure was still standing in front of my bedroom door. It seemed solid, not detailed in the sense that I could see a face or clothing, but detailed enough that my brain was not saying, maybe there is someone there. It was saying, there is someone standing in my room. I remember staring at it and trying to understand what I should do. Part of me still wanted it to be one of my parents. That explanation was safe. Maybe my dad was standing there waiting for me to notice him. Maybe my mom had entered quietly. But neither explanation really fit. They would have spoken. They would have moved. They would not just stand motionless in the darkness. And the figure seemed too tall. For a moment, I thought maybe somebody had somehow gotten into the house. That was worse. I did not know whether I should shout, run, stay completely still. I was trapped in that strange moment where fear makes every option feel dangerous. If I shouted and it was an intruder, what would happen? If I moved, would the person react? If I kept pretending to sleep, would they come closer? So I kept watching. I do not remember how long this lasted. Probably only seconds, maybe a little longer. Fear makes time difficult to judge. Something can happen for 10 seconds and feel like a minute. What I do remember is deciding that I needed light. There was a lamp beside my bed. I reached for it. That detail is one reason I am not completely certain it was classic sleep paralysis. I was able to move enough to turn on the lamp. I do not remember being completely unable to move. There was no crushing pressure on my chest, no feeling that I could not breathe, no sense of something physically holding me down. I was terrified, but I could move. Still, there are sleep-related experiences that happen while a person is only partly awake, and they do not always look exactly the same. At the time, of course, I was not thinking about any of that. I was thinking, turn on the light. I reached toward the bedside lamp. For some reason, I remember being afraid to look directly at the figure while the light came on. I switched the lamp on. Then I slowly opened my eyes. Nobody was there. The doorway was empty. The room looked completely normal. No tall person, no one hiding beside the door, nothing moving through the hallway. Just my bedroom. I sat there for a while, trying to process what had happened. The fear did not disappear when the figure did. If anything, the empty room created a different kind of fear. If someone had actually been there and walked away, I should have heard movement. If it was one of my parents, why would they leave without saying anything? If it had been a shadow, what exactly had created such a convincing human shape? And why did it disappear immediately once the room was illuminated? I did not sleep properly for the rest of the night. Every little sound bothered me. I kept looking toward the door. I think I eventually fell asleep again, but it was one of those nights where you never really feel relaxed. The next day, the whole experience seemed easier to explain. Sleep paralysis. That was the explanation I settled on. I had heard about people waking in the night and seeing figures in their bedrooms. Shadow people. Strangers, someone sitting on the bed, someone standing in the corner. Some people feel pressure on their chest or cannot move. Others hear footsteps, breathing, voices, or doors. It sounded close enough to what had happened that I accepted it. And I still think some kind of sleep-related hallucination is probably the most likely explanation. Maybe I woke while part of my brain was still dreaming. My bedroom was real. The door was real. The darkness was real. But the person standing there was dream imagery layered over the actual room. That would explain why the figure looked convincing. A dream does not have to be blurry. The brain can generate people, rooms, faces, and movement with incredible detail. If I was in a half-awake state, I could have been seeing my real bedroom while still experiencing one element of a dream. A tall person. That type of experience can feel completely different from an ordinary nightmare because you know you are in your room. You are not running through some fictional place. You are lying in your own bed. You can see your actual door. And then something impossible is standing beside it. That makes the experience feel external. There is also the possibility that the sound of the door opening was part of the same state. Maybe the door never moved. I could have dreamed the sound. Auditory experiences around waking can be extremely realistic. A bang, a voice, footsteps, someone calling your name. A door opening. The brain can generate sound just as convincingly as an image. Maybe I heard the door first because the dream needed a reason for someone to appear. Door opens. Footsteps. Person stands there. A complete sequence. That would explain why the figure was positioned directly in front of the doorway. The dream created a simple narrative. Someone entered. Now, someone is standing inside. Another possibility is that there really was some ordinary sound in the house. A door moved. A family member walked through the hallway. The building shifted. Something fell. I was sleeping lightly enough for the noise to wake me, but my brain incorporated it incorrectly. I heard a real sound, woke only partially, then generated the figure that seemed to explain it. That might be even more plausible. Dreams constantly incorporate real environmental sounds. An alarm becomes a phone ringing inside the dream. Thunder becomes an explosion. Someone walking in the hallway becomes footsteps inside the dream. Maybe one of my parents really did walk somewhere nearby. My sleeping brain turned it into someone opened your door. Then, I woke enough to see the room, but not enough to stop the dream image. That would create exactly the experience I remember. The repeated eye closing does not rule that out either. At the time, I thought, if this is just my eyes adjusting, blinking should make it disappear. But if the image was coming from the brain rather than the eyes, closing my eyes would not necessarily reset it. I could close them, open them, and the same figure would still be projected into the same location. The brain knew where the doorway was. It could keep putting the person there. That might explain why the figure seemed so stable. It was not changing with shadows. It was an internally generated image anchored to the room. Then the lamp came on. Suddenly there was much more visual information. The doorway, walls, floor, furniture, the brain no longer had darkness to fill in. The image disappeared. That is one of the strongest ordinary explanations. Darkness provides ambiguity. The brain completes missing information. Light corrects it. A shadow interpretation could work similarly. Maybe there was a real object near the doorway. A hanging coat. A shadow from furniture. The shape of the open door itself. At night, familiar objects can become surprisingly human. The brain is especially good at recognizing people. Sometimes too good. A few vertical shapes are enough. Head-like area. Shoulders. Long body. Now there is a person. If I had just woken up, my visual system may have been operating poorly. The figure could feel detailed because I was not actually seeing details. I was seeing a strong overall form. There is an important difference. I remember it as I clearly saw a person. But what did I actually see? A dark silhouette with human proportions. Probably no visible face, no specific clothing, no skin color. No identifiable features. That is enough for certainty in the moment, but not enough to rule out a shadow. The extreme height may also have come from the doorway itself. Dark vertical lines can stretch a figure. A coat hanging high. A shadow from the top of the door. A partially open door creating a long, narrow shape. My brain might have added head and shoulders. Then, because the room was dark, the lower part merged with surrounding shadow. The result looked unnaturally tall. The lamp would destroy the illusion immediately. Object becomes object. Shadow disappears. No person. That is possible. But I still remember closing my eyes several times and seeing the same figure when I reopened them. That stability is what made it so convincing. A random shadow usually becomes easier to understand after repeated looking. This one did not. Then again, I was frightened by that point. Fear can lock an interpretation in place. Once the brain decides person, it becomes difficult to see coat. You are no longer neutrally examining the shape. You are watching a possible intruder. That changes perception. Every second the shape remains still seems to confirm that someone is deliberately standing there. The lack of movement becomes creepy instead of informative. Maybe if I had stared calmly for 30 seconds, I would have recognized the object. I did not. I turned on the light. Another thing that makes a sleep-related explanation likely is the timing. I had been asleep. I woke suddenly. The experience happened immediately after waking. Then it ended once I became more alert and turned on a bright light. That sequence is exactly where I would expect dream imagery to intrude into waking perception. If I had been sitting awake in the room for 2 hours and then watched a person appear in front of the door, remain there, and vanish under direct light, that would be harder to explain through sleep. But I had just jolted awake. That matters. Whether it was technically sleep paralysis is another question. People use that term for a lot of nighttime experiences. Classic sleep paralysis usually involves waking while the body's normal REM-related muscle inhibition has not fully switched off yet. The person feels awake but cannot move normally. Many people experience terrifying visual or auditory hallucinations with it. I do not remember being physically paralyzed. I reached the lamp. So maybe sleep paralysis is not exactly the right label. It could have been a hypnopompic hallucination, meaning dreamlike perception during the transition out of sleep, or a false awakening, or just a brief, confused waking state. I cannot diagnose an event from one old memory, but all of those explanations exist within the same broad territory. I was waking. My brain was not completely synchronized yet. The figure may have belonged to sleep, while the room belonged to waking life. That explanation also makes the strange calm at the beginning make sense. My first thought was not monster. It was mom or dad. Dreamlike experiences often borrow ordinary expectations. There is someone in the room. Who usually enters my room? Parents. So the brain assigns that possibility first. Only when the figure does not behave normally does fear take over. I also wonder whether I actually heard one of my parents checking on me. Maybe someone opened the door, looked in, then left. I woke a few seconds later. My brain retained the sound. By the time my eyes opened, the real person was gone. But because my half-awake brain expected someone to still be standing there, it generated the silhouette. That would combine a real event with a hallucinated one. It could even explain why the sound of the door felt so convincing. Because it really happened. The tall figure would still be false. There is no way for me to know now. I did not immediately get up and ask, "Did either of you just open my door?" If I had, maybe the answer would have solved everything. Maybe my dad would have said yes. Maybe both parents would say they had been asleep. I do not remember checking. At 18, after a terrifying nighttime experience, my priority was staying in bed with the light on, not conducting an investigation. So I lost the opportunity. That is probably why the memory remains creepy. There was no final explanation, just figure. Light gone, one detail I do not think supports anything paranormal is that it remained when I closed my eyes and opened them. A lot of people hear that and think, if it were an illusion, blinking would make it disappear. Not necessarily. Perceptual errors can persist. Dream imagery can persist. A shadow can persist because the object causing it is still there. The repetition only proves that the experience was stable for a short period. It does not tell me what created it. The lamp is much more useful. Whatever I was seeing depended on darkness, or a half-awake state strongly enough that bright light ended it immediately. That fits ordinary explanations very well. If a real person had been standing there, the lamp should have revealed them, unless they somehow moved at exactly that second. But I was looking toward the doorway. I did not hear them run. There was no reason to think someone physically escaped. So I do not believe an intruder was actually in the room, and I do not think one of my parents was standing there either. The figure was probably never physically present. That does not change how real it looked. That is maybe the most unsettling lesson from the experience. Your brain can apparently show you a person who is not there with enough confidence that you will stare at them, blink repeatedly, and still believe you are looking at someone. You do not get a little message saying, "This is leftover dream imagery." You get a person standing beside your door. That is why sleep-related hallucinations can be so frightening. The experience is generated by the same brain you normally trust to tell you what is in the room. From the inside, there is no obvious difference. I have also thought about how the darkness probably affected me. When you wake suddenly at night, your eyes are not immediately adjusted. You may be looking at a room lit only by tiny amounts of ambient light. The brain fills in gaps. A doorway is especially likely to become a figure because it already has human-like proportions. Vertical frame, dark center, maybe clothing or furniture nearby. And if the door was partially open, The geometry could create the outline of shoulders or a body. The sound of the door opening would prime me even more. I expected a person, so I saw one. That chain is completely believable. Sound, expectation, ambiguous shape. Person, fear, then light. Correction, I think that is probably what happened. Either that or a brief dream hallucination. Maybe both. What I do not think happened is that some actual tall entity walked into my bedroom and vanished when I switched on a lamp. There is no evidence for that beyond the experience itself. And the sleep context gives me several better explanations. Still, knowing that does not erase the emotional memory. I can still picture the room. The dark doorway. The person standing there. Too tall. Silent. Completely motionless. I remember closing my eyes like I could reset reality. Opening them. Still there. Again, still there. That repetition made me feel trapped. If it had disappeared on the first blink, I probably would have rolled over and gone back to sleep. Instead, every time I looked, it waited. Then finally, I reached for the lamp. I switched it on. And there was nothing. I barely slept afterward. Not because I was convinced I had seen a ghost. Even then, part of me thought it was probably sleep paralysis or some weird dream state. I stayed awake because the experience had shown me that waking up did not necessarily mean my brain had finished dreaming. That was what scared me. I could trust the lamp. I could trust the empty room after the light came on. But for those few seconds before that, I had trusted my own eyes just as much. And they had shown me a very tall person standing silently inside my bedroom who was never there at all.
We will get back to the next confession in a moment. If you are new here, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more real stories from people who experienced something they still cannot explain. Your support helps keep these late-night broadcasts alive. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has unsettled you the most so far. Now, let's return to the signal.
I was walking home from the grocery store one afternoon, taking the same route I had taken plenty of times before. It was completely ordinary. Daylight, clear weather, blue sky. Nothing about the walk felt strange. I was carrying my groceries and probably thinking about whatever random thing people think about when they are making a familiar trip home. Then, for no reason I can explain, I suddenly felt like I should look up. It was not fear. I did not hear anything. There was no shadow passing over me. No strange sound. I just looked upward. And almost directly above me, maybe around 3 feet over my head from the way it appeared, was something white. Even now I have trouble describing it because every normal word makes it sound more solid than it actually looked. The closest comparison I have is a piece of white plastic. Not a bag exactly. Not paper. Not cloth. Plastic is simply the closest thing because the surface seemed to have a slight shine to it. Sunlight was reflecting from it. It was roughly the size of a dinner plate from where I stood. But it did not look like a complete object. That was the strange part. When I first saw it, it already seemed to be partially gone. I know how ridiculous that sounds. I do not mean that it was transparent like glass. I do not mean it was fading evenly, like an image on a screen. It looked more as if the background itself had started covering it. The blue sky behind it seemed to be replacing the white area. For maybe a fraction of a second, I watched the remaining white patch shrink. Then it completely disappeared, and suddenly there was nothing there. just blue sky. I stopped walking. I looked around. Nothing fell. Nothing drifted away. There was no white plastic bag floating down the street. No bird. No balloon. No cloud. No obvious aircraft. Nothing. That was why I stood there trying to understand what I had just seen. If it had simply blown away, I would have been fine. If I had looked up and seen a plastic shopping bag carried by a gust of wind, that would have been almost funny considering I had just come from a grocery store. But that was not how it appeared. I watched the visible part seem to get eaten away by the background. One moment there was a white reflective patch. Then the blue sky seemed to creep over the final section. Then it was gone. I have only told a few people about it because I never feel like I can describe the visual effect correctly. When I say something disappeared, people imagine an object blinking out instantly. That is not what I mean. When I say it dissolved, people imagine smoke. It did not look like smoke either. When I say the sky covered it, that sounds impossible because obviously the sky is not a physical sheet that moves in front of objects. But visually, that is what it reminded me of. Almost like watching an image being erased from one side. I know what I saw in the sense that I know there was a white patch blocking part of the background. I know it reflected sunlight. I know that when I noticed it, only part of whatever it had been seemed visible. And I know the last visible section vanished while I was looking directly at it. What I do not know is what actually caused that appearance. The simplest possibility is probably some lightweight object moving through the air. A piece of plastic, a small bag, a sheet of packaging, something caught in an updraft. Light objects can behave strangely in wind. They twist, fold, rotate, catch sunlight 1 second, and become almost invisible the next. A thin white piece of plastic viewed against a bright sky might look solid when the sun hits its broadside. Then, if it rotates edge on, the visible surface could shrink extremely quickly. The eye would see less and less white until nothing remained. That could look very much like the object was dissolving. Imagine holding a piece of paper flat in front of you. You see the entire rectangle. Now slowly rotate it. It becomes narrower. Narrower, then, when it is exactly edge on, it almost disappears. The object is still there. You just cannot see enough surface area to distinguish it. If something similar happened above me in less than a second, I might perceive the shrinking visible area as the sky moving across it. That explanation fits the background creeping over it surprisingly well. The object would not actually be vanishing. It would be turning. The boundary between white plastic and blue sky would move across my visual field as the visible face narrowed. Then the plastic would become edge on and effectively disappear. A breeze could carry it farther away before I located it again. That could explain why there was nothing visible afterward. Distance may also have been completely wrong. I remember it as being about 3 feet above me. But judging the distance of an isolated object against a clear sky is extremely difficult. There are no reference points, no wall behind it, no tree branch at the same depth, no shadow on the ground that I remember. The object may have been much higher. A small piece of plastic nearby and a much larger object farther away can create the same apparent size. When something is floating against open sky, the brain has to guess. Maybe it looked 3 feet above me because it appeared dinner plate sized and I unconsciously assumed a familiar object size. If it was actually 20 or 50 feet away, a small movement could carry it outside my viewing angle quickly. That makes an ordinary drifting object more plausible. There is also the possibility of a bird. That does not match my memory very well because I did not see wings or a recognizable shape. But a white bird turning in sunlight can change visibility dramatically. A gull or other pale bird can reflect brightly when one side faces the sun. Then it banks. The bright surface disappears. Against the blue sky, the darker edge might become difficult to see. If I caught only the last instant of a turn, I could see what looked like a white patch, shrinking and vanishing. The problem is that I remember the shape as more like a flat patch than an animal. Still, the observation lasted so briefly that I cannot put much weight on exact shape. I did not have several seconds to study it. I looked up during the final moment. My brain had very little information. That is another important part. I did not watch something appear, remain, and then vanish. I only caught what looked like the ending. For all I know, 5 seconds earlier it would have been obvious. Maybe it had been a tumbling plastic bag. Maybe a balloon. Maybe a bird. Maybe a piece of reflective material caught in a thermal. I looked up at the exact moment its orientation made it look impossible. That possibility bothers me because it means the mystery may exist only because of timing. A second earlier, I understand everything. A second later, I see nothing. Instead, I happen to look during the transition. The sudden urge to look up feels meaningful when I tell the story. Why did I look at exactly that moment? But people look around constantly without remembering it. Most upward glances reveal nothing interesting and disappear from memory. This one became important because something unusual was there. So afterward, it feels like something made me look. Maybe nothing did. Maybe I randomly looked upward thousands of times in my life, and this was simply the one time the timing mattered. There could also have been a visual effect involving sunlight. Bright light can create afterimages, glare, and temporary patches in vision. If I had glanced at something reflective beforehand, my retina might have produced a pale spot. Then, when I looked toward the blue sky, that spot could have been visible for a moment and faded. Afterimages can appear to block or alter the background. They can have edges. They can fade unevenly. And a clear blue sky is almost the perfect surface for noticing one because it is uniform. Normally, an afterimage disappears into a complicated scene. Against plain blue, it would stand out. But this explanation does not perfectly match my memory either. I remember the white patch as existing in space. It seemed to have a reflective sheen. It did not feel stuck to my field of vision. An afterimage usually moves when your eyes move. If I had shifted my gaze and noticed the patch move with it, I probably would have realized something was wrong with my vision. But the whole event was too short for me to test that. I saw it. It faded. Gone, I never had the chance to move my eyes around deliberately. There is another optical effect involving small objects very close to the eye. A tiny bit of debris, moisture, or something passing near your face can look much larger against a distant background. A pale insect wing, a seed, a fragment of plastic. If it crosses your view only inches from your eye, it could appear plate-sized against the sky. Then it moves out of focus and seems to dissolve. The sunlight reflecting from it could make the surface look glossy. That would also distort distance badly. What I thought was 3 feet above me might have been a few inches from my face. Again, no background reference means the brain guesses. A small airborne object very close to me could disappear from visibility almost instantly. That may be one of the simplest explanations. The background, creeping over it, could be the blurred edge losing contrast as the object moved out of focus. Our visual system does not give us raw pixels. It interprets boundaries. If a small, bright object becomes blurry against a bright background, its edges can seem to shrink inward. Eventually, the contrast drops below what the eye can detect. Now the object is still physically present, but visually it has vanished. Another possibility is that I saw a small cloud fragment. That sounds less likely because I remember a shiny plastic-like reflection rather than soft vapor. But very small, isolated wisps can disappear quickly in dry air. Sunlight can make the edge intensely bright. If only a tiny part remained when I looked up, it might dissolve while I watched. The blue background would literally appear to spread into it as the water droplets dispersed. That would match the word dissolve better than almost anything else. The problem is scale. A cloud that looks dinner plate sized from the ground would be much larger and much farther away than my impression. But, again, distance against open sky is difficult. Maybe I interpreted a distant tiny cloud as a nearby object because there was no size reference. Still, the reflective plastic quality makes me lean away from a cloud. It seemed too sharply defined, at least in memory. Memory is another complication. The experience was probably less than a second long, maybe 2. The description I give now is much more detailed than the amount of visual information I could possibly have processed consciously in that time. I remember white, shiny, plate-sized, partially gone, blue sky replacing it. Those may be accurate, but the exact shape of the edge, the speed of the disappearance, and the sense of distance may be reconstructions. Every time I have tried to explain it to someone, I have had to choose words. Plastic, dissolved, vanished, background, crept over it. Those words can strengthen the memory in that form. Years later, the description and the original perception become difficult to separate. That does not mean I imagined the event. Something caught my attention. Something white was there. The question is, how much of the current mental image comes from the original fraction of a second, and how much comes from repeatedly trying to make sense of it? I think the description, last step of vanishing, is probably the most important part. It felt as though I had interrupted an event already in progress. That is why the experience felt stranger than seeing something simply fly away. I never saw a complete object. It was already partially missing. But a rotating sheet could produce exactly that effect. Suppose a loose piece of white packaging was tumbling above me. At first, it was broadside to my view. Then, it started twisting. By the time I happened to look up, only one curved portion was still reflecting enough sunlight to be visible. As it continued rotating, that visible portion narrowed. The sky became visible across more of its previous apparent area. Then, the final bright strip turned away. Gone, from my point of view, it would look like an object being erased. That explanation has one advantage over almost every paranormal idea. It explains why the white patch had a sheen. Reflective material changes dramatically with orientation. The sun itself may have been doing most of the visual trick. It is also possible the object did not physically disappear at all. It only stopped reflecting. A piece of clear or translucent plastic can look bright white when sunlight reflects toward you. Change the angle slightly, and suddenly it becomes transparent. That may fit even better. Imagine a transparent plastic wrapper floating in the air. When the sun hits it at a certain angle, specular reflection makes it look opaque white. As it rotates, the reflection moves across the surface. The non-reflective part becomes nearly invisible against the sky, so the visible white area shrinks as the reflection sweeps away. To the observer, the background seems to take over. Then the final reflected patch disappears. The plastic is still there. You simply cannot see it anymore. That actually matches my memory almost perfectly. It would explain why I called it plastic before I had any theory. I saw a glossy white patch. It seemed partially transparent or absent. Then the sky replaced it. A thin, transparent wrapper changing angle in sunlight could look exactly like that. Wind could then carry it away unnoticed. If that is what happened, I may have witnessed something completely ordinary under exactly the right lighting to make it look impossible. There are also balloons and thin film materials that become difficult to see once the reflected highlight disappears. A small translucent balloon far above could change from bright white to almost invisible, depending on angle. But I do not remember any string or rounded form. Again, too brief. What I do not think I saw was an object literally phasing out of existence. That is the tempting interpretation because of the visual effect. Something was there. The background covered it. Now nothing. It resembles invisibility technology or some kind of cloaking effect. A science fiction version would be that I caught the last fraction of a second of something becoming invisible. The background creeping over it sounds almost exactly like digital camouflage. But there's no evidence for that. I did not see a larger hidden object. No distortion remained. No sound. No movement of air. No repeated event. Nothing else happened. A single ambiguous visual event is not enough to require something that extraordinary. There is also no reason to think it was supernatural. It did not behave like a ghost. There was no figure, no message, no connection to a person or location. It was simply a white patch in the air that stopped being visible. That strongly favors optics, or a small physical object. The fact that it happened in daylight is interesting because people often assume strange sightings require darkness. But daylight can create its own illusions. Sunlight creates glare, reflection, high contrast. Blue sky removes depth cues. Tiny objects become impossible to size. A reflective surface can flash into visibility and disappear almost instantly. In some ways, open sky is one of the easiest places to misjudge what you are looking at. There is nothing behind the object to tell you how far away it is. If I see a dinner plate-sized white thing against the building, I can compare it to windows and bricks. Against empty sky, dinner plate only describes the apparent size. A coin held close to my eye can cover the moon. That does not make them the same size. So my memory that it was 3 feet above me may be completely wrong. It could have been 30 feet, 300, or 3 inches from my face. That uncertainty opens a huge range of normal possibilities. If I had been able to watch it for another 5 seconds, distance might have become obvious. But there were no 5 seconds. That is what makes the whole thing so frustrating. I saw the mystery only at the moment when it ended. I also think about whether there might have been a thin fishing line, spider silk, or airborne web involved. Spider silk can catch sunlight and become brilliant white or silver. Large strands or sheets can drift through the air. Most are much too thin to look like a solid dinner plate, but if several strands or a small web mass caught the sun at once, it might briefly appear as a pale, reflective patch. Then a slight change in angle would make it vanish completely. People sometimes see floating spider silk only when sunlight hits it perfectly. 1 second, it is bright. Move your head slightly, and it is invisible. That mechanism is very similar to what I remember. Reflective visibility rather than physical disappearance. A sheet of plastic remains my stronger candidate because that was my immediate impression, but the principle is the same. The object may have disappeared only from sight, not from the air. I wish I had reached upward. If it truly was 3 feet above me, I might have touched it. But everything happened too quickly. By the time I understood that I was looking at something strange, it was gone. I wish I had watched the surrounding sky carefully afterward. Maybe the object became visible again a few feet away when it rotated. Maybe there was a tiny glint I missed. Instead, I was focused on the exact spot where it had disappeared. That is natural. Something impossible seems to happen, so you stare at where it happened. Meanwhile, the ordinary explanation may be drifting somewhere outside your attention. A little transparent wrapper could have been moving sideways the entire time. Once it lost its reflection, I would have no way to track it. Another interesting possibility is that the white area was a reflection from something above or behind me rather than an object itself. A car windshield. Window, piece of metal. Sunlight can reflect onto airborne particles or create bright patches in vision. But a reflection with no surface to land on is difficult to explain physically. Light needs something to scatter from. So if the patch looked suspended in the air, there was probably some material there. Plastic, moisture, dust, web, insect. Something that again points away from literal disappearance. I do not think the experience means my eyes were unreliable in some broad sense either. People can see a real thing and still misunderstand its physical behavior. I believe there really was some white or reflective visual stimulus above me. I do not think I fabricated the entire sighting. What I question is the conclusion that the object vanished. Vanish describes what my eyes experienced, not necessarily what happened to the object. It may have become transparent. Turned edge on, moved out of focus, lost the sunlight, passed beyond my angle. All of those would look like disappearance. That is probably the answer. But I understand why the experience is so difficult to explain to other people. The motion itself is unusual. Most people imagine disappearance as a fade. This did not feel like fading. It felt like replacement. Blue background taking over the white area. That specific visual makes more sense if the visible part was a reflected highlight moving across a transparent surface. As the reflection shrank, more sky became visible through or around the material. Then when the last highlight vanished, the entire object effectively disappeared. If I had to recreate what I saw physically, that is probably how I would try. Take a thin, transparent piece of plastic, hold it against a clear blue sky, angle it so the sunlight makes part of it look bright white, then slowly rotate it until the reflection moves off the surface. Watch the white patch shrink. At the right angle, the plastic may suddenly become almost impossible to see. That could be my entire mystery. A grocery bag, ironically enough, or some other piece of clear packaging floating on the wind. Maybe I was literally walking home from buying groceries when someone else's trash performed a perfect optical illusion above me. That would be a very ordinary ending. I am comfortable with that. Mostly, the part that still sticks with me is the timing. I did not see it arrive. I did not see a recognizable object first. I simply had the sudden impulse to look upward and caught what looked like the final fraction of something ceasing to exist. That is why my memory gives it more weight than it probably deserves. If I had watched a plastic wrapper tumbling for 10 seconds before it disappeared, I would have understood. If I had only seen empty sky, nothing. Instead, I saw the exact piece that made no sense. White, glossy, about the apparent size of a dinner plate. Already partly gone, the edge of blue sky moving across it. Then, nothing. I kept walking eventually because there was nothing else I could do. No one else seemed to react. No object landed nearby. The world continued normally. I told a few people afterward, but every time I tried to explain the way it disappeared, I could tell they were picturing something different. Maybe that is why I still remember it so clearly. I have never found the perfect word for what I saw. Not fading, not falling, not flying away, not popping out of existence. More like the visible part of it lost its argument with the background. The blue sky took over from one side until there was no white left. Years later, I think a rotating or translucent reflective object is probably the best explanation. It fits the sunlight. It fits the plastic like sheen. It fits the gradual loss of visible area. And it fits the fact that nothing else unusual happened. But for those few seconds on an ordinary walk home, I did not see a bag turning in the wind. I looked up and saw a small piece of the sky apparently unfinished, with something white still occupying it. Then, while I watched, the last visible part disappeared and the blue closed over it completely. Whatever it really was, I still cannot recreate the feeling of looking at clear sky afterward and knowing that 1 second earlier, something had definitely been there. When I was around 6 years old, my brother and I shared a bedroom. That meant bedtime rarely meant actually going straight to sleep. Most nights, we would lie there talking long after our parents had told us to be quiet. We would whisper about whatever kids talk about at that age, make jokes, argue about stupid things, or try to keep each other awake. It was normal for one of us to wake during the night every once in a while. What was not normal was for both of us to wake up at almost exactly the same time. But one night, sometime around midnight, that is what happened. I do not remember what woke me. There was no loud crash, no screaming, no light turning on. I just remember becoming aware that I was awake. My brother was awake too. For a little while, everything felt normal. Since we were both up, we started quietly talking. Neither of us seemed frightened. I think we were mostly amused that we had somehow both woken in the middle of the night. Then my brother suddenly stopped talking. He told me to be quiet. At first, I thought he was messing with me. Then I heard it too. The stairs were creaking. Our house had stairs that made noise when people walked on them. Anyone who has lived in a house with old or noisy stairs knows the sound. One board complains, then another. The sound changes position as someone moves. That is exactly what it sounded like. Not one isolated pop from somewhere in the house. It sounded like someone was using the stairs. We both went silent. I remember listening carefully. Creak, pause, then another. It seemed to move in the pattern of footsteps. At 6 years old, I did not think wood contracts when the temperature changes. I thought someone is on the stairs. The obvious possibilities were our parents. Maybe Mom had gotten up. Maybe Dad needed something. But the house otherwise seemed completely quiet. We did not hear voices. No bedroom door opening upstairs. No one called out. And for some reason, both my brother and I became nervous enough that neither of us simply went back to talking. We listened. Then the sounds moved away from the stairs. A little later, we heard something from downstairs that sounded like a kitchen cabinet opening. That was much worse. There's a very specific sound a cabinet makes. The little movement of the door. Maybe the hinge. Sometimes the wood shifts. Depending on the cabinet, there might be a slight knock when it reaches the end of its movement. We knew those sounds because we lived there. And what we heard sounded like someone opening one. Then, maybe another. But what was strange was that we did not hear them close. At least, that is how I remember it. Open, then silence. Another sound. No closing noise afterward. Now we were both scared. If it had only been me, I probably would have started questioning myself. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe I heard something outside. But my brother had been the one who noticed the sounds first. He had told me to stop talking because he heard something. Then I heard it independently. We were reacting to the same thing. That gave the whole situation more weight. We whispered about what we should do. Neither of us wanted to go downstairs alone. At 6, every dark hallway seems longer at night. Every doorway looks different. The house you know perfectly during the day can become unfamiliar once the lights are off. And now we believed someone was moving around downstairs. An intruder was probably somewhere in the back of our minds, even if I did not really understand the danger of that possibility yet. Eventually, we decided to go to our parents. We got out of bed and went to their room. I remember trying to stay close to my brother. If something really had been in the house, the last thing either of us wanted was to be alone. We woke our parents and told them what we had heard. Someone had been walking on the stairs. Cabinets were opening downstairs. There was somebody in the house. Our parents did what parents usually do when frightened kids appear in the bedroom at midnight. They tried to reassure us. But they also came downstairs. That part matters to me. They did not just send us back to bed immediately. They actually checked. We went down with them. I remember expecting to find some proof. An open cabinet. A person. A window open. Something knocked over. Anything that would explain what we had heard. Instead, there was nothing. No intruder, no one hiding, nothing obviously disturbed, and the cabinets were closed. That confused me almost as much as the noises themselves. We had heard them open. At least we were certain we had. Yet nothing downstairs matched the sequence we had listened to from bed. Our parents searched enough to convince themselves everything was fine. No stranger in the house. No obvious sign anyone had gotten inside. Nothing missing that I remember. To them, the answer was probably simple. Two young children had woken in the middle of the night, heard ordinary house noises, and scared each other. That is a very reasonable explanation. But my brother and I knew what we had heard. Or at least we believed we did. Neither of us felt like the other had invented it. He heard the stairs before I did. Then I heard them. We both heard the cabinet sounds. That is why the experience stayed with me. It was shared. Years later, I can think of several ordinary explanations that 6-year-old me never would have considered. The stairs are the easiest part. Wooden stairs can creak without someone standing on them. Temperature changes make wood expand and contract. At night, a house cools. Different materials shrink at slightly different rates. A board shifts against the nail. A stair tread moves against the support. Creak, then another piece adjusts. Creak. If several boards respond one after another, the sequence can sound exactly like footsteps. That is especially convincing when the noises happen along an actual staircase. Your brain already knows what footsteps there sound like. So when the stairs produce the same noises on their own, there is almost no reason to interpret them differently. The house does not need someone walking on it. It only needs the same pieces of wood to move. Heating systems can contribute too. If heat had been running and then switched off around midnight, the structure might have been cooling. Pipes can expand and contract. Walls can pop. Floorboards shift. A sound from inside the wall beside a staircase can seem like it came directly from a step. That could explain the first part completely. The cabinet noises are harder emotionally because they sounded so recognizable. But kitchens are full of things that make noises. Wood cabinets, metal pans, appliances, plumbing, refrigerators, heating pipes. The refrigerator alone can make surprisingly strange sounds when the compressor starts or stops. Plastic and metal inside expand and contract. Ice can shift. A refrigerator can produce pops, clicks, and knocks that sound like someone moving something nearby. If we were upstairs listening from a distance, we would lose the details that distinguish one sound from another. A pop in the kitchen becomes. Cabinet opened. A pipe knocking becomes. Another cabinet. We were not standing in the kitchen watching doors move. We were interpreting distant sounds through floors and walls. That distinction matters. There is also the possibility that one of our parents actually did get up briefly. Maybe someone used the bathroom, got water, checked something downstairs, then returned to bed before we came into their room. When we woke them, they may have been half asleep and genuinely not remembered moving around. People sometimes do ordinary things during the night and barely remember them. But if both parents were definitely asleep and stayed asleep until we woke them, then the house itself remains more likely. Another possibility is that the sounds came from outside. A neighbor closing something, someone walking near the house, a car door, a gate. Sound at night travels differently because everything else is quiet. With less background noise, distant sounds become more noticeable. Depending on the shape of the house, an outdoor sound can seem to come from indoors. A person walking on a nearby porch could sound like stairs. A trash bin lid could sound like a cabinet. At 6, I would never have considered that. If it sounded like the kitchen, then it was the kitchen. The shared experience does make one explanation less likely. I do not think both of us independently hallucinated the entire sequence. Could two half-asleep children influence each other? Absolutely. But there was probably a real sound. My brother noticed it first. He told me to listen. Then, I heard something. That means a real external noise is a very reasonable starting point. The uncertainty is what that noise actually was. There's also an important difference between sharing a sound and sharing an interpretation. My brother may have heard a creak. He said someone was on the stairs. Then I listened with that idea already in my mind. Now, when the next creak happened, I heard footsteps too. That is normal. Expectation changes perception. If somebody says, "Do you hear that knocking?" a vague sound immediately becomes knocking. If they say, "I think someone is walking upstairs," your brain starts organizing random creaks into footsteps. The same thing could have happened with the kitchen. Once we believed someone was moving through the house, every later sound belonged to that person. Stairs, now kitchen. Cabinet, another cabinet. A complete path formed. In reality, the sounds may have had nothing to do with each other. A stair tread cooled. A refrigerator popped. A pipe moved. 3 ordinary events. Our frightened minds connected them into one intruder walking through the house. That is probably one of the best explanations. Humans are extremely good at creating continuity. When something starts moving in one place and then you hear another sound elsewhere, your brain imagines the unseen movement between them. We did not hear every step from the staircase to the kitchen. We just assumed the same source traveled there. That is how stories form from incomplete information. At the same time, I understand why our parents telling us nothing happened did not feel satisfying. We were there. We heard it. When adults say, "It was nothing," children hear, "You imagined everything." But those are not the same statement. We may have heard completely real sounds. There simply may not have been a person causing them. That would explain why our parents found nothing. And the cabinets being closed does not prove we never heard cabinet-like sounds. It only proves no cabinet was left open when we checked. If an actual person had been in the kitchen opening cabinets, the fact that everything was closed is interesting. But even an intruder could close something after opening it. We said we never heard the closing sounds, but sound can be masked. Maybe the door closed gently. Opening produces a hinge squeak, closing does not. Maybe the kitchen was farther enough away that only certain frequencies traveled upstairs. Again, not impossible. But there was no evidence of an intruder. No broken door. No open window. No missing property. No person found. Without any physical sign, house noise is much more likely. I also have to consider memory. I was 6. This happened a long time ago. The core memory may be accurate, brother and I awake. He tells me to listen. Creaking, kitchen noises. Wake parents. They search. Nothing but exact details may have become cleaner over time. Maybe only one stair creaked. Now I remember multiple steps. Maybe the cabinet noise was one clunk. Now it is several doors opening. Maybe our parents found one cabinet slightly open but decided it was nothing, and that detail disappeared. Maybe the whole sequence lasted 30 seconds instead of several minutes. Childhood memories preserve fear better than timing. The things that make the story creepy are exactly the things memory is likely to emphasize. Both awake simultaneously. Footsteps, cabinets, nothing. There. That does not mean those details are false. It means I should not treat every tiny part like recorded evidence. One thing I do trust is the shared fear. My brother was scared enough that we went to our parents. I was scared enough to follow. Something definitely disturbed us. Whether the source was a person is a separate question. The fact that we both woke around the same time could itself have a normal explanation. Maybe the first creak woke both of us. I remember being awake before hearing the stairs, but memory may place the sound later because that is when we consciously noticed it. If a loud structural pop happened while we were sleeping, both of us could wake. Then, a minute later, more noises began. From our perspective, we mysteriously woke together, then heard something. Actual sequence. House makes first noise. Both children wake. More house noises follow. That would eliminate another strange coincidence. It is easy to assume we woke for no reason because we do not remember the first stimulus. But sleeping brains respond to sound before conscious memory begins. A door. Pipe, floorboard, wind, one noise wakes us. By the time we are fully aware, we do not remember hearing it. We only know we are awake. That explanation actually makes a lot of sense. Maybe the house had entered a cooling cycle. A first crack or pop woke both of us. Then, over the next few minutes, stairs and cabinets or kitchen materials continued shifting as temperatures changed. We heard a sequence of structural noises produced by the same environmental change. That would explain why multiple parts of the house seemed active at once. No person needed. The sound of cabinets opening but not closing is still a detail I remember vividly. But a house settling does not have to produce symmetrical noises. A board can make one loud pop when tension releases and nothing when it moves back. A cabinet door does not need to actually move at all. The material can make a hinge-like noise as it cools. The mind supplies the action. Maybe the reason nothing was opened downstairs is because nothing had ever opened. That is probably where I lean now. There may also have been plumbing near the kitchen. Water lines can make distinct knocks when pressure changes. If a toilet had refilled somewhere, a pipe could shift. If a hot water line cooled, it might contract against framing. Multiple knocks in different positions can sound like somebody opening doors. Again, boring explanation. But boring explanations become impressive once you realize how human they can sound at midnight. Old houses are especially good at impersonating people. A floorboard becomes a footstep. A pipe becomes someone knocking. A vent becomes breathing. A window frame becomes a door. The house does not need to be haunted. It only needs to be made of materials that move. The strange part is how quickly the brain adds a person. Something creaks. Who is there? That question appears before. Which building material changed temperature? For a 6-year-old, there is no competition. Someone is in the house. The possibility of an actual intruder still deserves mention because our parents were right to check. If children hear what sounds like someone inside the home, an adult checking is sensible. There are situations where ignoring noises would be unsafe. But in our case, the search found nothing. and nothing else happened afterward. No repeated attempt to enter. No disturbed belongings. No stranger seen. That makes the intruder explanation much weaker. If somebody had been moving around downstairs opening cabinets, where did they go? Unless there was an unnoticed exit route, they would need to leave before we came down. We would probably hear a door. Again, possible, but increasingly complicated. A house settling requires much less. The fact that our parents did not believe us probably made the memory stronger too. When you experience something frightening and someone tells you it did not happen, you rehearse it internally. No, I know what I heard. My brother heard it too. We both heard it. That repetition can preserve the event for years. If our dad had come downstairs, found a loose vent, and said, "That is what you heard," the mystery would disappear. Instead, there was no explanation. So the question stayed open. I also think our brotherly relationship mattered. We were used to talking at night. We knew each other's reactions. When he suddenly told me to be quiet, I knew he was not joking in that moment. That gave the sound credibility before I even heard it. If I had been alone, I might have pulled the blanket over my head and decided I dreamed it. Because he was there, it became shared reality. Years later, that is still the strongest part of the memory. Not the cabinets, not even the footsteps. The fact that he heard it too. But shared reality does not have to mean supernatural reality. Two people can hear the same pipe. Two people can hear the same staircase cooling. Two people can make the same reasonable but wrong interpretation. In fact, because we were in the same room, listening from the same position, we would be especially likely to make similar mistakes. The acoustic information reaching us was almost identical. And we were young enough to use the same simple model. Creaking stairs equal person. Cabinet noise equals person in kitchen. That model worked most of the time. That night, it may have failed. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if one of us had been brave enough to go downstairs immediately. Maybe we would have found Dad getting water. Maybe the refrigerator would make another loud pop right in front of us, and we would understand. Maybe a cabinet really would be hanging open. Or maybe everything would already be silent. We did what scared children should do instead. We got our parents. That meant there was a delay. By the time everyone came downstairs, the environmental noises had stopped. Whatever caused them left no obvious trace. That is how the mystery survived. There is nothing in the story that requires a ghost. We did not see anyone. No voice called our names. No object moved in front of us. No impossible event happened under direct observation. We heard sounds that strongly resembled human activity. Then found no human. That is creepy. But it is also something houses do extremely well. If the stairs had been completely silent for years, and then one night produced perfect footsteps followed by actual cabinet doors found open, I would find the story harder to dismiss. But without physical evidence, I think ordinary building noise remains the strongest explanation. Still, when I remember it as a child, the rational explanation does not recreate the feeling. I remember lying there beside my brother in the dark, talking quietly, then hearing him suddenly say, "Be quiet." I remember both of us listening, the stairs creaking one after another, our room becoming completely silent. Then the sounds from downstairs, something that seemed to open, then another, and no closing. I remember looking at my brother and knowing from his face that he had heard exactly what I had. We were no longer trying to keep each other awake. We wanted our parents. Then walking through the dark house toward their room, trying not to make too much noise ourselves, waking them, explaining that somebody was downstairs, going back with them. Lights coming on. Every room becoming ordinary again. Cabinets closed. No stranger, no evidence. Only our parents telling us we must have heard normal house sounds. Maybe they were right. I actually think they probably were. But I also think my brother and I heard something real. The mystery is not whether the night was silent. It was not. Something made those sounds. I just no longer think something has to mean someone. Maybe a temperature change moved the stairs. Maybe the refrigerator or pipes made the kitchen noises. Maybe the first sound woke both of us before either of us consciously remembered hearing it. Then, two half-awake 6-year-olds built a person from a sequence of ordinary noises. That explanation is good enough for me now, but it was not good enough then. At 6, houses did not expand and contract. Pipes did not impersonate footsteps. Cabinets did not sound like they opened unless somebody touched them. So when our parents came downstairs and found no one, the conclusion was not that we had misunderstood the sounds. The conclusion was much simpler. Someone had been moving through the house. And somehow, before we got downstairs, they had disappeared. Years later, I know there are better answers. But I can still remember lying beside my brother and hearing the house behave exactly like a person was awake inside it. The stairs first, then the kitchen, then nothing. And what bothered me most was that when the lights came on, the house looked as though it had never made a sound at all.
The broadcast is ending, but some voices do not disappear when the radio goes quiet. Maybe one of tonight's confessions will stay with you. Maybe you will remember it the next time your phone rings at an odd hour, or when you hear something outside after midnight. Leave a comment with the story that got under your skin the most. Subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more stories from the people who called in after something went wrong.